Tippi Hedren was the picture of Hollywood grace. Blonde, poised, untouchable. She became Alfred Hitchcock's ultimate leading lady, the haunting beauty of the Birds and Marnie. But behind that icy elegance was a young woman who was terrified, trapped, and silenced. For decades, the world only saw the glamour, the suspense, the artistry. No one asked what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. No one wondered why Tippi disappeared from the spotlight just as fast as she had entered it. And for decades, she let them wonder. She never told the full story. She never said what really happened on Hitchcock sets, or how it shattered her career, her confidence, and nearly her sanity. Until now, at 95, Tippi Hedren is finally being heard. And what she's revealing, not just about Alfred Hitchcock, but about the silence that followed, has left fans stunned. Because what happened behind the scenes wasn't just cruel. It was calculated, and it destroyed everything she worked for. Before she was Hollywood's most mysterious leading lady, Tippi Hedren was just a girl from Minnesota with a dream. Born Natalie K. Hedren in 1930, she started her career as a model. Her striking features, graceful posture, and that air of cool composure making her a favorite in department store catalogs and magazine covers. She never saw herself as an actress. That world belonged to others, she thought, until one man decided otherwise. Alfred Hitchcock noticed her in a television commercial for a diet drink. Just a few seconds of her turning and smiling on screen, nothing more. But to Hitchcock, she was perfection. The next Grace Kelly, perhaps. He called her in, had her screen tested, and gave her the lead role in The Birds. It was her very first film. Tippi was 32 years old, older than most newcomers, a single mother. She had never acted professionally, but there was something about her presence, quiet, elegant, with a hint of mystery, that made her unforgettable. Hitchcock saw it and he didn't want to let it go. From the outside, it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. A first-time actress handpicked by the greatest suspense director in the world. For most women in the industry, that kind of break was impossible. And for a while, Tippi believed it too. She was grateful, loyal, willing to prove herself. She followed Hitchcock's instructions, took his direction, and tried not to question anything. But very quickly, things started to feel off. He didn't just want her for the role. He wanted to shape her entirely. Hitchcock controlled everything. Her wardrobe, her hairstyle, the way she walked and spoke. He instructed photographers on how to shoot her, publicists on how to present her. Even her off-screen image had to match the icy blonde archetype he adored. But beneath that controlled exterior, Tippi was uneasy. She hadn't signed up for this kind of possession. Still, she gave her all to the Birds. The production was physically grueling. In one of the most famous scenes where her character is attacked in an attic, she was told fake birds would be used. Instead, real ones were tied to her costume and hurled at her for days on end. She was scratched, bruised, and emotionally wrecked. At one point, she collapsed on set. A doctor ordered a week of rest. But she came back, and she finished the film. It became a box office success. Tippi was praised for her performance, especially for someone with no acting background. The critics called her poised, elegant, enigmatic, perfect Hitchcock blonde. What they didn't know was that behind those cold eyes was a woman slowly unraveling. She was exhausted, unsure of herself, and beginning to realize that Hitchcock's attention came with a cost. But still, she stayed. She signed a contract. She agreed to do another film, because what other choice did she have? She had a daughter to raise, career to build, and no one to protect her if she walked away. To the public, Tippi Hedren looked like a rising star. But behind the scenes, she was already caught in a web she couldn't escape. And Hitchcock? He wasn't done with her yet. When audiences think of the Birds, they remember terror. Flocks of crows swarming, gulls smashing through windows, a woman screaming as chaos descends. What they don't realize is that the fear on Tippi Hedren's face wasn't always acting. Behind the scenes, the film's most harrowing moments were real, and many of them happened at Tippi's expense. The most infamous example is the attic scene. Hedren's character is trapped in a dark, dusty space as birds violently attack her from all angles. Hitchcock told her that mechanical birds would be used for safety. But when the cameras rolled, it was real birds, live, flapping, terrified creatures, thrown at her repeatedly by crew members from above. They scratched her face, tore her skin, and came within inches of her eyes. This went on for 5 full days. She later described it as one of the most traumatic experiences of her life. But at the time, she didn't dare speak up. She was under contract. Hitchcock controlled her career. And in that era of Hollywood, a young actress, especially one without allies, didn't challenge a powerful director. Worse, Hitchcock wasn't just directing the film. He was directing her life. He kept her isolated from the rest of the cast, making it difficult for her to bond with co-stars or find emotional support. Crew members were discouraged from talking to her. She was often left to eat alone. It was a method of control disguised as professionalism, keeping his discovery untouched by outside influence. There were rules about her wardrobe, her makeup, her posture, even how she moved on set. Hitchcock was known for his obsession with perfection, but when it came to Tippi, that obsession felt personal, possessive, and suffocating. His wife, Alma Reville, herself a brilliant editor and collaborator, was always nearby. She was involved in the filmmaking process, but she rarely intervened. Many have wondered whether she saw what was happening and chose to stay silent, or whether she, too, was trapped in a different kind of loyalty. Still, Tippi pushed through, because despite the fear and exhaustion, she believed in the work. She believed the birds could be her breakthrough, and it was. When the film was released in 1963, she was catapulted into stardom. Overnight, she became the face of suspense cinema. Reviewers called her a revelation, an icy masterpiece, Hitchcock's new vision. But beneath the praise, something darker was festering. Hitchcock's fixation wasn't fading, it was growing. He insisted she immediately begin filming Marnie, his next psychological thriller. And although the script required deeply intimate scenes, Tippi wasn't given a choice. Her contract bound her to him, and her silence protected him. In public, Hitchcock appeared amused and charming. He joked about working with his girl, crafting the illusion of a mentor guiding his protege. But in private, the tension had begun to curdle. Tippi no longer felt safe. What once seemed like a career-making opportunity now felt like a trap she couldn't escape. She was wounded, physically and emotionally, but she kept showing up. Because in that era, actresses didn't quit. They endured. And Tippi? She was enduring more than anyone realized. The production of The Birds was finally over. But for Tippi Hedren, the nightmare was only beginning. Marnie would push her further into the shadows, emotionally, professionally, and dangerously close to the edge. When Tippi Hedren stepped onto the set of Marnie, it was supposed to mark the next phase of her stardom. But in reality, it was the beginning of her disappearance. The Birds had made her a household name, but it had also given Hitchcock complete control. She was under contract. He held the rights to her next projects. And Marnie wasn't just another film for him. It was a psychological experiment, and Tippi was its unwilling subject. From the beginning, something felt different. The script was darker, the tone colder. Her character, Marnie, was emotionally fractured, repressed, and frequently humiliated on screen. The role required vulnerability, intimacy, and trust. But any trust Tippi had once had in Hitchcock was already unraveling. Privately, he had begun to isolate her even more. He monitored her movements, gave orders that she wasn't to speak with other men on set, called her at home at odd hours. It wasn't just about control, it was about ownership. Tippi later described how Hitchcock's behavior became deeply uncomfortable. Though she never gave detailed accounts publicly, she strongly implied that he crossed boundaries in ways that left her shaken. His fixation went beyond professional interest. It was personal and it was possessive. When she resisted, when she tried to set boundaries, he retaliated. During filming, Hitchcock reportedly increased the number of takes for emotionally grueling scenes. He pushed her harder, demanding more vulnerability, more exposure. One scene, in particular, involved a disturbing on-screen assault. It was filmed over and over, for hours. Tippi later said it felt less like directing and more like punishment. The crew noticed the tension. Co-stars whispered about how cold and strained the dynamic had become. But no one stepped in. Hitchcock was too powerful. His vision, his methods, his authority, none of it could be questioned. And Tippi, despite her growing distress, kept working, because walking away wasn't an option. When the film wrapped, she tried to move on. She requested to be released from her contract. She wanted to work with other directors, explore different roles, take control of her own future. Hitchcock refused. He didn't just keep her under contract, he shelved her, refused to cast her in anything else, turned down offers from other studios that wanted to work with her. He effectively shut down her career one silent decision at a time. And for years, no one knew. To the public, Tippi Hedren had been Hitchcock's mysterious blonde discovery. And then she was gone. The assumption was that she had lost interest or faded out. But the truth was far more brutal. She was locked out, not by scandal, not by failure, but by a man who couldn't stand her saying no. She had said no once, and it cost her everything. In those years, Tippi focused on raising her daughter, Melanie Griffith. She stepped out of the spotlight, not because she wanted to, but because she had been erased. Looking back, Marnie wasn't just a film. It was a reckoning, a quiet war between a woman trying to keep her dignity and a man determined to keep control. And while critics debated the movie's artistic merits, Tippi was already carrying the scars of what had happened behind the scenes. Scars no one wanted to talk about. Not yet. By the mid-1960s, Tippi Hedren had all but vanished from the Hollywood spotlight. No scandal, no explanation, just silence. And in that silence, assumptions filled the void. People whispered that she'd been difficult, that she had an attitude, that maybe she hadn't been as talented as she looked. The truth? She was blacklisted not by Hollywood as a whole, but by one man who had the power to stall her career with a single decision. Alfred Hitchcock had made her a star, and then, just as quickly, he had taken it away. Behind the scenes, Tippi was desperate to find work. She'd been offered roles by other major directors, François Truffaut for one, but Hitchcock turned them all down. He held her contract like a cage. She couldn't work for anyone else unless he allowed it. And he didn't. For nearly 2 years, she waited. And nothing came. She could have gone public. She could have told the world what was happening. But in the 1960s, there was no safe space for women to speak out. Not in Hollywood, not in the press, and certainly not against someone as revered as Hitchcock. If she had spoken up, she wouldn't have been protected. She would have been destroyed. So she stayed quiet. Part of it was survival. Part of it was fear. And part of it was for her daughter, Melanie. Tippi didn't want to raise a child in the wreckage of a public battle. She didn't want her daughter to see her as angry or bitter or broken. So she carried the weight privately and turned her focus inward, to parenting, to healing, and eventually, to building a life far from the control of studios and egos. Still, the damage lingered. Her name faded from casting calls. Interviews became rare. She appeared in small films, low-budget projects, television guest spots. But the moment of stardom she'd once held was gone. Not lost, but taken. And in that silence, Tippi began to understand something deeper. This wasn't just about her. She was part of a pattern, a system that had crushed the careers of women before her, and would go on to do the same to many more. But even with that knowledge, she still couldn't bring herself to speak out publicly. It wasn't until decades later, after Hitchcock's death, after her daughter had grown up, that she began to tell the story. Even then, she was careful. In her memoir, she didn't name every detail. She didn't sensationalize. But what she did say was enough. That she had been controlled, intimidated, manipulated. That she had been punished for setting boundaries. That the cost of her silence was everything she had worked for. The industry didn't know what to do with her honesty. Some dismissed it as bitterness. Others quietly applauded her bravery. But Tippi wasn't trying to make headlines. She was simply telling the truth. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. Because in the years since, her story has taken on a new kind of meaning. Younger actresses, Activists and film historians now look to Tippi not as a footnote in Hitchcock's career, but as a symbol of strength in an era that refused to protect women. She didn't just survive him, she endured him, and then she lived a life on her own terms. But even as her truth finally found daylight, the damage had already been done. The silence she was forced into left a mark, not just on her career, but on her legacy. Tippi Hedren had once been the next Grace Kelly, but because she said no, she was left behind. It took decades for Tippi Hedren's story to surface, and when it did, it didn't explode, it simmered. Quietly, steadily, her voice began to thread through conversations that Hollywood had long avoided. Her memoir, Tippi, released in 2016, wasn't a takedown. It was a reflection, measured, painful, honest. She didn't accuse Hitchcock with outrage. She simply laid out what she endured. The control, the obsession, the punishment. It wasn't a revelation meant to destroy. It was meant to be understood. And for many fans, it was the first time they realized what she had truly lost. By the time she released her book, Alfred Hitchcock had long been enshrined in cinematic history. His films studied, praised, immortalized. But what Tippi revealed cast a long shadow over that legacy. Suddenly, viewers saw the Birds and Marnie differently. Those iconic scenes were no longer just suspenseful. They were painful, real. Not fiction, but fragments of her lived experience. At 86, she was no longer the glamorous blonde of the 60s. She was a woman who had survived decades of silence and carried herself with dignity through all of it. And her story didn't just resonate. It opened a door. Because in the years that followed, the #MeToo movement erupted. Suddenly, actresses across generations were speaking out about abuse, harassment, coercion, about how power had been used not to create but to control. And Tippi's story was no longer a footnote. It was a foundation. She had been one of the first, long before it was safe to speak, long before the world was willing to believe. Her courage, in retrospect, felt even more profound. But while some hailed her as a pioneer, others struggled to reconcile her pain with the man they had idolized. Hitchcock was a genius, they said. His films were masterpieces. How could those truths exist alongside what she claimed? Tippi never asked them to choose. She didn't demand Hitchcock be erased. She simply asked to be remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who had been denied the chance to reach her full potential. And even at 95, she never softened what happened. She didn't forget, but she never let it define her either. She continued to act occasionally, but her greatest joy came from something else: rescuing animals. She founded the Shambhala Preserve, a sanctuary for big cats, where she dedicated years to caring for lions, tigers, and leopards, creatures who had been mistreated or abandoned, just like she had once been. That work, she said, gave her peace. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of her story. Not that she endured what she did, but that she came out of it not hardened, but full of grace. She aged with elegance. She raised a daughter who became a successful actress in her own right. And she told her truth not to reclaim fame, but to reclaim her voice. Tippi Hedren will always be remembered for the Birds and Marnie. But now, she's remembered for something more. The quiet strength of a woman who survived the power games of Hollywood's golden age and lived long enough to be heard. Her story didn't come with a perfect ending, but it came with the truth. And in the end, that was all she ever really wanted. Tippi Hedren was never meant to be a survivor. Not in Hollywood's eyes. She was meant to be a symbol of beauty, of mystery, of control. A muse molded by a man who believed he owned the women he directed. But Tippi was never just an image. She was a person. And when she resisted, she paid the price in silence, in isolation, and in a career that could have soared so much higher, if only she had been free. She didn't speak out when it would have made headlines. She didn't build her identity around what was done to her. She waited. She endured. And then, when the world was finally ready to hear it, she told the truth. Not with anger, but with clarity. Not for revenge, but for peace. At 95, Tippi Hedren isn't just a former actress from Hollywood's golden age. She's a living reminder of what it means to be silenced, and then to speak, And in that way, she's become more than the icy blonde Hitchcock tried to create. She's become something far stronger herself. For more emotional stories, check out this video.